A millionaire brought a janitor to a gala, expecting to embarrass her. What she revealed during the night left the entire crowd speechless. The grand ballroom of the McAllister estate was alive with music, laughter, and the tinkling of champagne flutes. Beneath the high, arched ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers, New York's elite mingled, their designer attire gleaming under the soft golden light. At the center of it all stood Charles McAllister, a tall, impeccably dressed man in his early 40s with sleek black hair slicked back and a perpetual smirk that hinted at his unrivaled confidence. Wealth had always been Charles's armor, and tonight, it gleamed brighter than ever. Charles loved throwing these extravagant parties, not for the sake of charity, as the invitations claimed, but for the performance. He thrived on the whispered envy of his peers, the eager laughter at his sardonic wit, and the power that came with holding the room's attention. He didn't just want to be admired, he wanted to be feared. Leaning casually against the marble bar, Charles sipped his vintage scotch while scanning the crowd. His closest friend and partner in mischief, Julian Hartwell, approached, holding a half-empty glass of champagne. Julian, younger by a few years, had a knack for enabling Charles's worst instincts. Another masterpiece of excess, Julian remarked with a grin, gesturing toward the lavish room. "How do you keep outdoing yourself?" "It's a gift," Charles said, shrugging modestly, though his smirk deepened. "Speaking of which, I'm in the mood for a little entertainment." Julian's eyebrows rose. "What sort of entertainment?" Charles's gaze shifted toward the window, where he could faintly see the McAllister Tower glinting in the distance. "Let's make it interesting," he mused. "You remember the janitor in my building? What's her name?" "Turner?" Julian blinked, confused. "Grace Turner? What about her?" Charles leaned closer, his voice dripping with mischief. "I want to invite her to my next event." "Grace? The janitor?" Julian nearly spilled his drink. "Why in the world would you?" Charles interrupted with a chuckle. "Why not? Picture it. A woman like her, in a place like this. Can you imagine the looks on everyone's faces? The whispers, the awkwardness? It'll be priceless." Julian hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "That seems cruel, don't you think?" "Cruel?" Charles echoed, laughing as if Julian had told a joke. "It's a harmless joke. Besides, she'll get a taste of luxury for a night. If anything, she should thank me." Julian opened his mouth to argue, but Charles waved him off. "Don't be so dramatic, Julian. Life's a game, and she's just another piece on the board." At McAllister Tower, Grace Turner's day was ending much like it began. She worked the evening shift, methodically cleaning the cavernous office spaces after the building's high-profile tenants had gone home. She was in her mid-30s, with a kind face framed by loose curls and an air of quiet resilience. Life had taught her that dignity came not from titles or wealth, but from how one carried themselves in the face of adversity. Grace was wiping down the boardroom table on the 27th floor when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw a sharply dressed man holding a sleek black envelope. "Grace Turner?" the man asked. "Yes," she replied cautiously, setting down her cloth. "I have an invitation for you," he said, handing her the envelope without further explanation. "Mr. McAllister insists." Grace frowned but accepted the envelope, her hands brushing over the embossed gold lettering on the front. She opened it and read aloud. "You are cordially invited to the McAllister Charity Gala this Saturday at 8 p.m. The courier offered no further details before striding away, leaving Grace alone with the invitation in her hand. For a moment, she simply stared at it, her mind racing with confusion and suspicion. Why would someone like Charles McAllister invite her, a janitor, to one of his exclusive events? Charles lounged in his penthouse, sipping his evening espresso while watching the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was pleased with his plan. Grace Turner would be the perfect addition to his little spectacle. The thought of her trying to fit in among New York's elite amused him endlessly. He'd seen her in passing during late-night office visits, a woman with a plain uniform, sensible shoes, and a quiet demeanor. She wasn't the type to turn heads, but she carried herself with an understated dignity that Charles found curious. It was precisely that unshakable poise he wanted to test. Let's see how far that confidence of hers goes, he thought aloud, a sly grin creeping across his face. Back at her modest apartment in Queens, Grace sat on the edge of her worn-out couch, staring at the invitation on the coffee table. Her best friend, Alice, was sitting cross-legged on the floor, munching on a bowl of popcorn. "So, are you going?" Alice asked, her voice laced with skepticism. Grace shrugged. "I don't know. It doesn't make sense. Why would someone like him invite someone like me?" Alice snorted. "Probably to make fun of you. You know his type. Rich, bored, and too full of themselves to care about anyone else." Grace considered this. She wasn't naive. She knew the games people like Charles McAllister played, but a small voice in her mind whispered something different, something daring. "Maybe I should go," she said finally. Alice nearly choked on her popcorn. "What? Why?" "Because," Grace said slowly, a spark of determination in her eyes. "If he thinks I'm just a janitor he can mock, maybe it's time to show him he's wrong." The week passed quickly, and Saturday evening arrived. The McAllister estate glittered like a jewel, every inch of it exuding wealth and opulence. Guests arrived in sleek black cars, their laughter and chatter filling the crisp night air. Charles stood at the entrance, greeting each guest with the charm of a seasoned host. But his eyes frequently darted toward the driveway, waiting for Grace's arrival. He was eager to see how she'd handle the moment, certain it would be awkward and uncomfortable. At precisely 8:15, a modest car pulled up to the curb. Grace stepped out, dressed in a simple yet elegant navy gown that hugged her figure modestly. Her hair was swept up in a loose chignon, and she wore a single silver bracelet on her wrist. She wasn't dripping in diamonds or designer labels, but she had an air of quiet grace that silenced the crowd for a moment. Charles's smirk faltered ever so slightly as he watched her ascend the marble steps, her head held high. Something about her presence unsettled him, not because she didn't belong, but because she seemed to belong more than anyone else. As Grace reached the doorway, Charles extended his hand, his smile strained. "Grace Turner," he said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Welcome." Grace took his hand briefly, her gaze unwavering. "Thank you, Mr. McAllister," she replied smoothly, a subtle edge in her tone. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world." The evening had only just begun, but already, Charles had the unsettling feeling that this game might not go as planned. Before we dive deeper into Grace's decision to attend the gala, imagine yourself in her shoes for a moment. What would you do if someone like Charles McAllister invited you to such an event? Would you accept, or would you walk away? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're here, don't forget to like this story and subscribe for more thought-provoking narratives. The faint hum of the subway rumbled beneath the streets as Grace Turner made her way home from the McAllister Tower, her steps steady despite the weight of another long shift. Her sturdy work boots scuffed against the pavement as she passed through her neighborhood in Queens, a place where the streetlights buzzed softly and the smell of corner store tacos lingered in the air. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers, a world built on resilience, quiet pride, and the unshakable bonds of community. Grace's apartment, a modest but tidy space on the second floor of an aging brick building, was her sanctuary. The creak of the wooden floorboards and the faint scent of lavender from her small diffuser greeted her as she locked the door behind her. She set down her work bag, her routine practiced and deliberate. The envelope bearing the McAllister logo lay conspicuously on the coffee table, its glossy surface catching the dim light of her reading lamp. Her cat, Marigold, hopped onto the table, her orange fur a blur of motion as she pawed curiously at the envelope. Grace smiled faintly and scratched behind Marigold's ears. "You're as curious as I am," she murmured. Sinking into the worn cushions of her couch, Grace let out a long breath and stared at the invitation. It didn't belong in her world. The weight of its presence felt like a breach of some unspoken boundary. Why would a man like Charles McAllister, a man whose wealth and influence could eclipse entire neighborhoods, invite her, of all people, to one of his events? At 35, Grace was no stranger to hard work. She had spent the past decade cleaning office spaces, sweeping away the detritus of busy executives who barely noticed her presence. But Grace had always carried herself with quiet dignity, a sense of self-worth that couldn't be eroded by the dismissive glances or casual indifference of the world around her. Born and raised in the Midwest, Grace had grown up on a small farm with her parents and two older brothers. Life had been simple but tough, filled with early mornings, the scent of freshly turned soil, and the constant hum of cicadas in the summer. Her parents had instilled in her a deep sense of responsibility and fairness. No matter what life throws at you, her mother used to say, you hold your head high and treat people with kindness. After losing her parents in a car accident when she was 21, Grace had moved to New York to start fresh. The city had been a stark contrast to the wide-open fields of her childhood, but it had taught her resilience. She took on any job she could find, saving every spare dollar and finding joy in the small victories, like buying her first piece of furniture or mastering the subway system. Despite the challenges, Grace had never lost her sense of purpose. She volunteered at local shelters, spent weekends tutoring underprivileged kids, and quietly donated portions of her modest income to causes she believed in. She wasn't wealthy by any measure, but her heart was rich with compassion. Later that evening, Grace's best friend, Alice, dropped by for their usual Friday night catch-up. Alice, a lively and outspoken nurse with a penchant for colorful scarves, let herself in with the spare key and plopped onto the couch. "Tell me you're not still staring at that thing," Alice teased, gesturing toward the invitation. Grace shrugged, her lips twitching into a half-smile. "It's hard to ignore." Alice grabbed the envelope and waved it in the air dramatically. "Grace Turner, invited to rub elbows with New York's elite? You know what this is, right? This is your Cinderella moment." Grace laughed softly. Cinderella had a fairy godmother. "All I've got is you, and unless you've been hiding some magic wand, I don't see a transformation happening." Alice leaned closer, her tone more serious. "Okay, jokes aside, you should go. I know you're suspicious, and honestly, I'd be too. But maybe this is one of those rare moments where life surprises you. Worst case scenario, you get a free meal and a good story out of it." Grace leaned back, considering Alice's words. "But why me? Why now? It feels off." "Because you're not like them," Alice said bluntly. "And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly why you should show up. You've spent so long staying under the radar, Grace. Maybe it's time to remind the world you're not invisible." The days leading up to the event were filled with a quiet buzz of anticipation. Grace wasn't one to make a spectacle of herself, but something about the invitation stirred a sense of defiance within her. She wasn't foolish enough to think Charles McAllister's gesture was purely altruistic. There was a game being played, and she had decided to play along. On the morning of the gala, Grace stood in front of the small mirror in her bedroom, inspecting herself critically. Her dress, a simple navy gown borrowed from Alice, hung neatly on the closet door. It wasn't flashy or elaborate, but it was elegant in its simplicity, a reflection of Grace herself. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alice. "Remember, confidence is your best accessory. Go knock them dead." Grace smiled at the screen and tucked her phone into her bag. Taking a deep breath, she whispered to herself, "Head high, Grace. Head high." At precisely 7:45 p.m., Grace hailed a cab and made her way to the McAllister estate. The city lights blurred past the windows as her nerves simmered beneath the surface. She had faced plenty of challenges in her life, but this was different. This was stepping directly into the lion's den. When the car pulled up to the estate, Grace took a moment to steady herself before stepping out. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of roses from the manicured gardens lining the driveway. The estate loomed before her, all gleaming marble and intricate ironwork, like something out of a modern-day fairy tale. As she approached the entrance, the low murmur of the crowd reached her ears, mingling with the strains of a live string quartet. Grace tightened her grip on her small clutch, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and determination. Head high, she reminded herself again, stepping into the golden light spilling from the grand doors. Inside, the room was a sea of glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos. Conversation swirled around her like a current, but Grace stood firm, her posture poised and her expression calm. The room's energy shifted slightly as heads turned toward her, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Grace spotted Charles McAllister near the bar, his polished smile faltering ever so slightly when their gazes met. He recovered quickly, striding toward her with a practiced charm. "Grace Turner," he said, his tone smooth but laced with condescension. "You made it." "Of course," Grace replied, meeting his gaze evenly. "I wouldn't miss it." For a fleeting moment, Charles hesitated, caught off guard by the quiet strength in her voice. The night was young, and already, the game wasn't going quite as he had planned. Charles McAllister stood in the vast study of his estate, surrounded by walls lined with leather-bound books he had never read. A glass of brandy swirled lazily in his hand as he leaned against the heavy oak desk, a smirk curling his lips. The game he had set in motion was proving more entertaining than he expected. Grace Turner, he mused aloud, her name lingering on his tongue like an inside joke only he understood. I wonder how she'll handle it. Behind him, Julian Hartwell sat in a leather armchair, nursing his own drink. Unlike Charles, Julian wasn't laughing. He tapped his glass absently, his unease clear in the subtle furrow of his brow. "You're really going through with this?" Julian asked, his tone cautious. "Inviting a janitor to one of the most exclusive events in New York. What's the endgame, Charles?" Charles chuckled, turning to face his friend. "Endgame? It's not chess, Julian. It's theater. A little social experiment to shake things up." Julian set his glass down, leaning forward. "But why her? You've never even spoken to the woman." "That's exactly why," Charles said, shrugging. "She's an enigma, and people like her don't belong in rooms like ours. The juxtaposition, it'll be priceless." Julian shook his head. "You're playing with fire. What if this backfires?" Charles laughed, a deep, self-assured sound. "What could possibly go wrong? It's a party, Julian. She'll be out of her element. People will talk, and by the end of the night, she'll disappear back into obscurity." Miles away, in her modest Queens apartment, Grace stood in front of her bathroom mirror, carefully adjusting the pins in her hair. The reflection staring back at her wasn't entirely familiar. Alice's gown fit her perfectly, the navy fabric hugging her frame with understated elegance. Her hair was swept into a loose chignon, soft curls framing her face. For once, she allowed herself to marvel at the transformation. Alice stood behind her, arms crossed, a satisfied grin on her face. "Now that," she said, "is how you make an entrance." Grace chuckled softly. "It's just a dress, Alice." "It's not just a dress," Alice corrected. "It's a statement. You're walking into that place with your head held high, and you're going to show them exactly who you are." Grace's smile faded slightly as she turned back to the mirror. "And who am I, really? To them, I'm just a janitor." Alice stepped forward, placing her hands firmly on Grace's shoulders. "To them, maybe, but you and I both know better. You've got nothing to prove, Grace. Just be yourself." Grace nodded, her resolve hardening. "You're right. I don't need to prove anything. But I'm not going there to blend in either." As Saturday evening approached, Charles paced the length of his vast living room, scanning the guest list one final time. The most powerful names in New York's business and social circles would be in attendance. CEOs, politicians, celebrities. All eyes would be on him, as they always were. But tonight, they would also be on Grace Turner. Everything ready, he called to his assistant, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who managed Charles's affairs with ruthless efficiency. "Yes, sir," she replied. "The press coverage is discreet but present. The catering, entertainment, and guest arrangements are all confirmed." Charles nodded, satisfied. "Good. Make sure our special guest is announced properly when she arrives." "Understood," the assistant said, though a flicker of doubt crossed her face. Charles didn't notice, or didn't care. The cab ride to the McAllister estate was quiet, save for the faint hum of the radio. Grace sat in the back seat, her hands resting lightly on her lap, the invitation tucked neatly into her clutch. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes briefly scanning her elegant attire. "You heading to the McAllister Gala?" he asked. "Yes," Grace replied, her voice calm but firm. The driver whistled. "Big night. You with the press or something?" "No," Grace said simply. "I'm a guest." The driver's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he said nothing more. As the car pulled up to the estate, Grace took a deep breath. The golden glow of the chandeliers spilled out onto the marble steps, illuminating the parade of sleek black cars and glamorous guests. She could feel the weight of their gazes as she stepped out, but she kept her head high, her movements deliberate and poised. Inside, the gala was in full swing. The air buzzed with the chatter of New York's elite, their laughter mingling with the soft strains of a live string quartet. The room was a symphony of opulence, gilded walls, crystal chandeliers, and tables laden with fine china and cascading floral arrangements. Charles stood near the bar, a glass of champagne in hand, his sharp eyes scanning the room. When Grace stepped through the grand doors, his smirk widened. She was a vision of calm confidence, her every step measured and deliberate. She didn't stumble or falter. She met the stares of the crowd with quiet defiance. Julian appeared at Charles's side, his expression unreadable. "She's here." "So she is," Charles said, his tone smug. "Let the fun begin." Grace's entrance had not gone unnoticed. Whispers rippled through the room, speculative and curious. Who was she? What was she doing here? Some guests dismissed her as a curiosity. Others couldn't take their eyes off her. As Charles approached, Grace turned to meet him, her gaze steady. "Mr. McAllister," she said, extending her hand. "Miss Turner," he replied, taking her hand briefly. "I must say, you clean up well." Grace's smile was faint, her tone cool. "Thank you. I'm glad you think so." Charles gestured toward the room. "I trust you're finding everything to your liking?" "It's certainly impressive," Grace said, glancing around. "Though I imagine you didn't invite me here just to admire the decor." Charles chuckled, feigning innocence. "Of course not. I thought it might be enlightening for you to see a different side of things." Grace tilted her head, her smile never wavering. "I appreciate the opportunity." As the conversation ended, Charles walked away, his confidence unshaken. But deep down, he couldn't help but feel a slight unease. Grace Turner wasn't what he had expected, and the night was just beginning. The McAllister estate radiated opulence, its sprawling gardens dotted with twinkling lanterns that guided the city's elite up the polished marble steps. Inside, the grand ballroom was alive with the hum of conversation, the delicate strains of a string quartet, and the scent of fresh lilies mingling with the air of exclusivity. Charles McAllister, as always, stood at the center of it all. He was a man accustomed to admiration, the type who drew attention without effort. His sharp tuxedo was tailored to perfection, the black fabric as immaculate as his reputation among New York's social elite. With a glass of champagne in hand, Charles surveyed the glittering crowd, a smirk tugging at his lips. Tonight wasn't just another gala. It was a game, and he was the puppet master. Julian Hartwell, his longtime confidant, approached with a cautious expression. "You look entirely too pleased with yourself," he remarked, his voice low enough not to draw attention. Charles chuckled, taking a leisurely sip of his drink. "Why shouldn't I be? Tonight's a masterpiece in the making." Julian frowned, his discomfort evident. "You're really going through with this?" "Of course," Charles replied, waving off Julian's concern. "A little disruption never hurt anyone. Besides, don't you think our guests deserve some entertainment?" Julian crossed his arms, his tone hardening. "She's a person, Charles, not a prop for your amusement." Charles tilted his head, feigning contemplation. "A person, yes, but one who doesn't belong in this world." "It's not cruelty, Julian. It's reality." Julian opened his mouth to argue, but the conversation was cut short by the arrival of the evening's centerpiece. Grace Turner stepped out of the cab and onto the driveway, her breath catching slightly at the sight of the McAllister estate. The sprawling mansion, all gleaming marble and wrought iron, seemed to stretch endlessly under the night sky. She adjusted the hem of her navy gown, a simple yet elegant piece borrowed from Alice, and smoothed a stray curl that had escaped her updo. The faint hum of music and conversation drifted toward her as she ascended the steps. Guests in glittering attire moved past her, their laughter ringing in the cool evening air. Grace kept her head high, her movements deliberate, though her heart pounded with every step. Inside, the ballroom was a sensory overload of wealth and refinement. Gilded walls caught the light of crystal chandeliers, casting a golden glow over tables laden with champagne flutes and artful arrangements of fresh flowers. Waitstaff wove seamlessly through the crowd, their trays balancing delicate hors d'oeuvres. Grace hesitated for the briefest moment before stepping fully into the room. Heads turned as the soft click of her heels carried her across the polished floor. The chatter around her softened, replaced by a wave of whispers that rippled through the crowd. "Who is she?" someone murmured. "Isn't she the janitor from McAllister Tower?" Another voice whispered. "She doesn't look like one," came a doubtful reply. Grace met the stares head-on, her expression calm and composed. She had spent her life navigating spaces where she didn't seem to belong, but tonight, she had made a choice. She wasn't here to blend in. Charles, watching from the bar, felt his smirk falter as he caught sight of her. Grace Turner had arrived, and she was nothing like he had imagined. "Impressive," Julian said quietly, following Charles's gaze. Charles scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's a borrowed dress and good lighting. Keep telling yourself that," Julian replied, a hint of satisfaction in his tone. Charles straightened his posture and made his way toward Grace, determined to reassert control. "Miss Turner," he said smoothly, extending his hand as he approached. "Welcome. You look transformed." Grace shook his hand briefly, her grip firm. "Thank you, Mr. McAllister. I appreciate the invitation." Her tone was polite, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath her words. Charles noticed it immediately, a subtle defiance that made him pause. "Of course," he replied, his smile sharpening. "I trust you'll find the evening enlightening." Grace tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "I'm sure I will." For a moment, they stood there, a silent tension crackling between them. Charles was used to commanding the dynamics of every interaction, but something about Grace's unflinching composure threw him off balance. As the evening unfolded, Grace moved through the room with a quiet confidence that defied expectation. She joined conversations with ease, her insights and humor drawing attention from even the most skeptical guests. At one point, she found herself speaking with a renowned architect about sustainable design practices, offering thoughtful commentary that left him nodding in agreement. Nearby, a hedge fund manager dismissed the idea of investing in community programs as a waste of resources. Grace, overhearing the remark, stepped into the conversation with calm authority. "Strong communities aren't just a moral obligation," she said, her tone measured. "They are the foundation of long-term economic stability. When people thrive, so do the businesses around them." The manager opened his mouth to counter, but closed it again as several heads around the table nodded in agreement. Charles, who had been watching from across the room, felt a knot of irritation tighten in his chest. This wasn't the narrative he had orchestrated. Grace wasn't awkward or overwhelmed. She was commanding the room in ways he hadn't anticipated. By the time dinner was served, Grace had become the quiet center of attention. Guests who had initially dismissed her as a curiosity now leaned in to hear her speak, their skepticism replaced by intrigue. Charles found himself seated beside her, the conversation at the table lively but increasingly focused on Grace. She navigated the discussions with ease, her voice calm yet compelling. Charles, for the first time in years, found himself at a loss for words. As dessert was served, Grace leaned slightly toward him, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "I appreciate the opportunity to be here, Mr. McAllister," she said, her tone even. "But I have a feeling this isn't quite what you had planned." Charles forced a smile, though his grip on his champagne glass tightened. "Plans evolve, Miss Turner. The night is still young." Grace returned his smile with one of her own, serene and unshakable. "Indeed it is." As the night wore on, Charles couldn't shake the growing unease in his chest. Grace Turner wasn't what he had expected, and the balance of the evening was beginning to shift. For the first time, he felt as though he wasn't the one in control, and that thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The ballroom seemed to pulse with life as the night deepened. The sparkling chandeliers overhead cast golden light over the sea of guests, their laughter and conversation filling every corner of the McAllister estate. Yet, despite the glittering distractions, a singular presence had begun to capture the room's focus. Grace Turner, with her composed demeanor and quiet confidence, moved through the crowd like a ripple in still water. She wasn't loud or ostentatious, but there was an undeniable energy about her that drew eyes and, more importantly, ears. Guests who had dismissed her earlier as a peculiar addition to Charles McAllister's opulent affair now found themselves leaning in when she spoke, curious and, at times, disarmed by her poise. From the far end of the room, Charles stood at the bar, his glass of champagne untouched. His sharp eyes tracked Grace as she engaged with yet another group of influential guests. He had orchestrated this evening, carefully curating every detail, every moment. But Grace's presence had introduced a variable he hadn't accounted for, and it irritated him. Julian Hartwell, his longtime friend and occasional voice of reason, approached with his usual air of amusement. "You've been staring at her for a while now," he said, leaning casually against the bar. "She's intriguing," Charles admitted, though the word felt insufficient. Julian chuckled. "Intriguing? That's a first for you. Usually, you'd call someone like her entertaining." Charles turned, his smirk tight. "She's playing her part well, is she?" Julian asked, arching an eyebrow. "Or is she just being herself?" Charles didn't respond. His focus returned to Grace, now deep in conversation with Victor Malone, the venture capitalist known for his brash opinions. Grace stood at the center of a small circle, her voice calm yet commanding. Victor Malone, tall and broad-shouldered with an air of practiced authority, was holding court with his usual bluster. "The issue with community investments," Victor declared, swirling his glass of bourbon, "is that they're ultimately unsustainable. They drain resources without yielding measurable returns. It's basic economics." Grace listened without interrupting, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. When Victor finished, she spoke, her tone even but firm. "Community investments aren't about quick returns," she said. "They're about building stability. When people are given the tools to improve their circumstances, it creates a ripple effect: better education, healthier families, stronger local economies. Those outcomes benefit everyone, including investors." Victor raised an eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged. "Idealism doesn't pay the bills, Miss Turner." Grace's gaze didn't waver. "Neither does short-sightedness." The surrounding guests exchanged glances, their interest piqued. Evelyn Carver, a renowned philanthropist with decades of experience, nodded approvingly. "She's right," Evelyn said. "Sustainability is the key to meaningful progress. Short-term gains are just that, short-lived." Victor leaned back, his confidence faltering. Grace, meanwhile, remained composed, her words settling over the group like a challenge they couldn't ignore. Charles had been watching the exchange closely, his irritation growing with each passing moment. Grace wasn't supposed to fit in this seamlessly. She was supposed to be out of her depth, a curiosity for the crowd to gossip about. Instead, she had turned the room's attention away from his meticulously planned evening and toward herself. Determined to regain control, Charles crossed the room and approached Grace just as her conversation with Evelyn was winding down. "Miss Turner," he said smoothly, his voice cutting through the chatter, "may I steal you for a moment?" Grace turned, her expression neutral but attentive. "Of course." Charles gestured toward the grand staircase. "I thought you might enjoy a tour of the estate. It's not every day we host such a unique guest." The words were carefully chosen, laced with subtle condescension, but Grace didn't react. Instead, she nodded and followed him as he led her out of the ballroom. The tour began in the East Wing, where the walls were adorned with oil paintings of McAllister ancestors and artifacts collected from around the world. Charles spoke with practiced ease, recounting the family's storied history and their many contributions to society. Grace listened politely, her eyes scanning the room as though searching for something deeper beneath the surface. "And here," Charles said, stopping in front of a large portrait, "is my great-grandfather. He was instrumental in expanding the family's business empire during the early 20th century." Grace tilted her head, studying the painting. "Impressive," she said. He must have been a man of great ambition. Charles smirked. Ambition runs in the family. Grace met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Ambition can achieve a lot, but it can also come at a cost. Charles stiffened slightly. Success always requires sacrifice. Whose sacrifice? Grace asked, her tone calm but pointed. The question hung in the air, and for a moment, Charles found himself at a loss. Grace's words had a way of cutting through the veneer he so carefully maintained, leaving him exposed in ways he didn't understand. By the time they returned to the ballroom, the energy of the evening had shifted again. Guests were still mingling, but there was an undercurrent of speculation that hadn't been there before. Grace had become more than a guest. She was a presence, one that couldn't be ignored. As the night wound down and the last of the champagne was poured, Grace made her way toward the exit. Charles intercepted her at the top of the grand staircase, his polished smile firmly in place. "Leaving already?" he asked. "It's late," Grace replied simply. "And the evening has been illuminating." He raised an eyebrow. "Illuminating in what way?" Grace paused, her gaze steady. "You learn a lot about people when you observe how they use their power." Charles blinked, caught off guard by the weight of her words. Before he could respond, Grace offered a polite nod and descended the staircase, disappearing into the night. He stood there for a long moment, her parting words echoing in his mind. Grace Turner wasn't just a guest. She was a disruption. And for the first time in years, Charles McAllister wasn't sure he was in control. The days following the McAllister Gala were anything but ordinary. The event, meant to showcase Charles McAllister's affluence and charm, had instead left a ripple in its wake. Whispers circulated among the city's elite about Grace Turner, the poised and enigmatic woman who had outshone the glittering crowd. She had not sought attention, yet her presence had become the focal point of countless conversations. For Charles, the aftermath of the evening was unsettling. He prided himself on his ability to control every narrative, yet Grace had walked into his carefully constructed world and unraveled it with quiet defiance. He couldn't stop thinking about her final words at the gala. "You learn a lot about people when you observe how they use their power." The weight of that statement gnawed at him. Now, as he stood in his sprawling office on the 50th floor of McAllister Tower, Charles gazed out at the city skyline, his hands resting on the edge of his sleek mahogany desk. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, but for once, he felt like a stranger to himself. A knock at the door broke his reverie. His assistant entered, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. McAllister, there's a woman here to see you," she said. "She doesn't have an appointment, but she insists it's urgent." Charles frowned, his mind racing. Did she give a name? Grace Turner. The name sent a jolt through him. He straightened, smoothing his tie as he nodded. "Send her in." Grace stepped into the office, her presence immediately commanding the space. She wore a tailored gray coat over a simple black dress, her hair loosely pinned back. She looked composed but carried an air of purpose that Charles couldn't ignore. "Miss Turner," he said, motioning toward the chair opposite his desk. "This is unexpected." Grace sat down, her posture as steady as her gaze. "I imagine it is," she replied. "But I thought it was time we had a conversation." Charles leaned back, folding his hands together. "By all means." For a moment, there was silence as Grace considered her words. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but firm. "You like games, Mr. McAllister. You thrive on control, on using people as pieces on a board. But have you ever stopped to think about the consequences of those games?" Charles stiffened slightly, though he masked it with a faint smile. "I assure you, my actions are always calculated." "Calculated," Grace repeated, her tone sharp. "And do you calculate the lives you disrupt in the process?" Her words hung in the air, cutting through the polished veneer of Charles's confidence. "I don't see the relevance of this conversation," he said carefully. "If you have something to say, Miss Turner, I suggest you get to the point." Grace's expression didn't waver. "I will." She leaned forward slightly, her voice low but steady. "Your actions destroyed my father's business. You took everything from him, our home, our stability, his dignity. And when he couldn't see a way forward, he ended his life. Charles froze, her words hitting him like a physical blow. For a moment, he couldn't speak, his mind scrambling to make sense of what she had said. I don't. You don't remember, Grace interrupted, her voice rising slightly. Of course you don't. To you, it was just another deal, another acquisition to strengthen your empire. But to us, it was everything. Charles felt the weight of her gaze, her pain cutting through his carefully maintained composure. Grace, She stood, her movements controlled but tense. I didn't come here for an apology, Mr. McAllister. I came here to make you understand. For years, I've worked to rebuild what your ambition tore apart. Not for vengeance, but for purpose. You thought you could use me as a pawn at your gala, but I've been playing my own game. Charles rose slowly, his mind racing. If I wronged you, you didn't just wrong me, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. You destroyed a part of me. My father wasn't the only thing I lost that year. He stared at her, the gravity of her words settling heavily in his chest. What do you mean? Grace's eyes glistened, though she held back her tears. I was pregnant, she said quietly. The stress, the fear, the loss, it was too much. I lost the baby. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. I've spent years trying to rebuild, not just for me, but for the people who depend on me, Grace continued, her voice steady again. And while you've built your empire on the backs of others, I've been creating something real, something lasting. Charles sank back into his chair, his mind spinning. I didn't know, he said finally, his voice hollow. I didn't know any of this. That's the problem, isn't it? Grace said. You don't know because you don't care to know. People like you never look at the damage you leave behind. For the first time in years, Charles felt truly powerless. The woman standing before him wasn't just an unexpected guest at his gala. She was a mirror, reflecting back everything he had ignored, everything he had taken. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace regarded him for a long moment before answering. I want you to feel the weight of your actions. Not through words, but through change. You have resources, influence, power. Use them to fix what you've broken. Not for me, but for the people you've harmed. Charles nodded slowly, her words sinking deep into his mind. I will, he said, his voice tinged with sincerity. I'll do whatever it takes. Grace's gaze softened slightly, though her resolve remained firm. We'll see. She turned and walked to the door, pausing briefly before looking back. This isn't about redemption, Charles. It's about responsibility. Don't forget that. And with that, she was gone, leaving Charles alone in his office. The city skyline stretched out before him, but for the first time, it felt hollow. He had built his empire on ambition, but now he was beginning to see the cracks in its foundation. The weight of Grace's words pressed down on him, and he knew one thing with certainty. His life, and the way he wielded his power, could never remain the same. The days following Grace Turner's visit to his office were some of the longest of Charles McAllister's life. Her words lingered like an open wound, raw and unrelenting. He had spent years perfecting the art of indifference, of brushing aside the consequences of his actions as the cost of ambition. But now, for the first time, those consequences had a face, a voice, and a story that refused to be ignored. Charles stood in his penthouse living room, gazing out at the city that had once felt like his kingdom. The shimmering skyline, usually a source of pride, now seemed to mock him. The silence of the room was oppressive, broken only by the faint ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. He turned away from the window, his movements uncharacteristically slow. On the coffee table lay a stack of documents he'd pulled from the company archives, records of deals he had long forgotten, each one a thread in the web of his empire. Among them was the acquisition of the small company Grace's father had once owned. Charles sank into the leather couch, his head in his hands. He didn't remember the details of the deal, but the cold numbers on the page told the story. A calculated takeover that had crushed a struggling business. He could almost hear Grace's voice echoing in his mind. You don't care to know. The next morning, Charles took the first step in what he knew would be a long and painful journey. He arrived at McAllister Tower earlier than usual, bypassing his assistant's questioning look as he entered his office. Sitting at his desk, he made a list. Names of the people and businesses he had harmed, those he could remember and those he could trace through his records. One name stood out above the rest: Turner Industries. The company Grace's father had built with his own hands, only to see it dismantled and sold for parts. Charles reached for the phone and dialed a number he rarely used. "Julian," he said when his friend answered. "I need your help." Julian arrived an hour later, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What's going on?" he asked, taking a seat across from Charles. Charles slid the stack of documents across the desk. "These are the deals I've made over the years, the ones that caused the most damage. I need to start making things right." Julian raised an eyebrow. "And you think you can fix it all with a few checks?" "No," Charles admitted, his tone somber. "I know I can't undo the harm I've caused, but I can stop ignoring it. I can take responsibility." Julian leaned back in his chair, studying his friend. "This isn't like you, Charles. What changed?" Charles hesitated before answering, his mind flashing back to Grace's piercing gaze. "I met someone who made me see things differently." Over the next several weeks, Charles dedicated himself to the task with a single-minded determination that surprised even him. He began by reaching out to the families and businesses affected by his actions, offering not just financial compensation but tangible resources to help them rebuild. When he contacted a community center that had been forced to close due to one of his development projects, he didn't just write a check. He personally visited the site, meeting with the people who had once relied on it. A young woman who had grown up attending the center's programs confronted him directly. "Do you think money can fix this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. "No," Charles replied quietly, "but it's a start, and I'm here to do more than write a check. I want to listen, to understand how I can help rebuild what I've broken." His sincerity, though met with skepticism, gradually began to break through the walls of mistrust. Meanwhile, Grace watched from a distance, her emotions a mix of vindication and cautious hope. She had heard of Charles's efforts through mutual connections and the subtle ripples his actions were creating in the community. But she remained wary, unwilling to believe in his transformation until she saw it for herself. Her own life had continued as usual, though the encounter with Charles had left its mark. She threw herself into her work, doubling down on her commitment to the causes she championed. But there were moments, late at night when the world was quiet, that her mind drifted back to their conversation. Could people truly change? One evening, Grace received an unexpected email from Charles. It was brief, straightforward, and unpolished. A stark contrast to the carefully crafted messages she imagined he usually sent. "Grace, I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want you to see what I'm trying to build now. If you're willing, I'd like to show you. No games, no pretense, just an honest conversation." Charles Grace stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Tomorrow at 2 p.m. The next afternoon, Grace arrived at a small community center in Harlem. It was a far cry from the glittering offices of McAllister Tower, but it buzzed with life. Children played in the courtyard, while volunteers distributed supplies and helped with homework inside. Charles was waiting for her near the entrance, dressed in casual clothes that seemed oddly out of place on him. He looked nervous, a stark contrast to the confident man she had met at the gala. "Grace," he said, stepping forward. "Thank you for coming." She nodded, her expression neutral. "Show me." He led her through the center, explaining the programs he had helped fund and the partnerships he had forged to ensure its sustainability. He introduced her to staff members and volunteers, letting their stories speak for themselves. When they reached a quiet corner of the building, Charles turned to her, his expression earnest. "I know this doesn't erase what I've done, but I want you to know that I'm trying, not just for you, but for the people I've hurt. I want to be better." Grace studied him, her emotions swirling. She could see the effort he was making, the cracks in his polished exterior that hinted at something real beneath the surface. "It's a start," she said finally, "but real change takes time. It's not about proving yourself to me. It's about proving it to them." Charles nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I will." As Grace walked away that day, she felt a strange sense of closure. Charles McAllister was far from redeemed, but he was no longer the man who had destroyed her family. He was a man trying to rebuild, piece by piece, and while she couldn't yet say she forgave him, she could admit that his journey had begun. The city seemed different to Charles McAllister as he stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the cool evening air brushing against his face. The lights that once symbolized his power and dominance now carried a humbling reminder of how fragile and interconnected the world truly was. He had spent months unraveling his empire, not dismantling it, but reshaping its purpose. And while the process was far from complete, Charles felt the first stirrings of something unfamiliar: hope. Below, the city moved with its usual vibrancy, unaware of the quiet transformation taking place within one of its wealthiest inhabitants. Charles had begun to see himself not as a king ruling over his domain, but as a steward responsible for repairing the cracks he had created. The journey of change hadn't been linear, nor had it been easy. Charles spent long hours meeting with people who had been impacted by his actions, families displaced by his developments, workers whose livelihoods he had disrupted, and community leaders who had fought against the very projects that made him wealthy. Each meeting was a reckoning, forcing him to confront the human cost of his ambition. He didn't hide behind excuses or platitudes. Instead, he listened, sometimes in silence, as the weight of their stories settled on his shoulders. One of the most pivotal moments came during a visit to a neighborhood he had once bulldozed to make way for luxury apartments. Standing amid the modest homes that had been rebuilt through grassroots efforts, Charles met Maria Gonzalez, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. "You're the man who tore us apart," Maria said bluntly. Charles nodded, his voice low. "I am, and I'm here to make it right, if you'll let me." Maria studied him for a long moment before replying. "We don't need your guilt. We need your resources. If you're serious, show us." From that day forward, Charles worked closely with Maria and her neighbors, funding community initiatives and supporting their plans for sustainable growth. The process wasn't about charity, it was about partnership. Slowly but surely, trust began to grow where there had once been only resentment. Meanwhile, Grace Turner continued her work with renewed focus. The confrontation with Charles, while painful, had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying. She poured herself into her projects, collaborating with nonprofits and local leaders to expand their reach. Her reputation as a leader and innovator flourished, attracting the attention of philanthropists and investors alike. But despite the newfound recognition, Grace remained grounded. She knew the work wasn't about accolades. It was about creating lasting change. Their paths crossed again several months later at a fundraiser for affordable housing initiatives. Grace had been invited as a keynote speaker, and Charles attended quietly, sitting toward the back of the room. When Grace took the stage, she spoke with her usual blend of passion and practicality. She shared stories of resilience, emphasizing the importance of community-driven solutions. As she spoke, Charles felt a swell of admiration. She wasn't just inspiring. She was transformative, a force of nature moving the world in ways he could only aspire to. After her speech, Charles approached her cautiously, waiting until the crowd had thinned. "You were remarkable," he said simply. Grace turned, her expression softening when she saw him. "Thank you," she replied. "I didn't know you were here." "I wouldn't have missed it," he said, his tone earnest. "You've done incredible work." Grace studied him, noting the change in his demeanor. He seemed less polished, less rehearsed, as though the weight of pretense had finally lifted. "How's your work going?" she asked. "It's humbling," Charles admitted. "I'm learning more than I ever thought possible, about people, about myself." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "Change takes time, Charles. But it sounds like you're on the right path." Their conversation was brief, but it left a lasting impression on both of them. For Charles, it was a reminder of the road ahead. For Grace, it was a glimpse of what redemption might look like, not as a destination, but as a journey. Months turned into years, and the ripple effects of their choices began to spread. Charles restructured his company, focusing on ethical investments and community partnerships. He established a foundation dedicated to supporting underserved neighborhoods, using his resources to empower rather than exploit. The transformation didn't go unnoticed. Some of his peers mocked him, accusing him of losing his edge. But Charles didn't care. He had discovered something far more valuable than profit: purpose. Grace, too, continued to grow in her work. She expanded her reach, mentoring young leaders and advocating for systemic change. Her collaboration with Charles, once unthinkable, became a powerful example of how even the deepest divides could be bridged. One evening, years after the gala that had set everything in motion, Charles found himself standing in a modest community center, watching as children played in the courtyard and volunteers bustled around. Grace was there too, laughing as she helped a group of kids paint a mural. Charles approached her, his footsteps quiet but deliberate. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward the mural. Grace turned, smiling softly. "It is." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the scene unfold around them. "You've changed a lot," Grace said finally, her tone thoughtful. "So have you," Charles replied. She shook her head. "Not really. I've just become more of who I've always been." Charles considered her words, a faint smile touching his lips. "Maybe that's what change really is, becoming who you were meant to be." Grace didn't reply, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. As the evening faded into night, Charles and Grace parted ways once again. Their paths, though different, remained intertwined by the shared understanding of what it meant to rebuild, to take responsibility, and to find purpose in unexpected places. For Charles, the journey wasn't over. He knew there would always be more work to do, more bridges to build. But for the first time, he faced the future not with fear, but with determination. And for Grace, the world felt a little brighter. A reminder that even in the darkest corners, change was possible and goodness could be found in the most unlikely of places.